Good morning. I'm Justin, and I'm with Campus Collective. Also, regular attender of your church. So it's good to be here this morning. Excited to share the word with you this morning from 1 Samuel chapter 17, which is on the story of David and Goliath. It's a familiar story, but in this story, what we're going to explore this morning is this idea of story, and particularly the stories that we believe and the kinds of realities that they create. And so to give you a little bit of example, when I was a young child in a church similar to this, kind of a young adult, I was invited to come and start doing prayer and communion meditation. We had a very similar flow as we have here. And as a 12-year-old, I was given prayer, and I was given offering meditation, communion meditation. That continued throughout my teenage years, and throughout that, I had people in my congregation start to come up to me, and they're like, "You're going to be the next pastor of our church one day." And I was like, "No, I'm not." But there was this consistent story through multiple members of my congregation that they told me that I was going to be a pastor someday, that the Lord was going to use me, and that I was going into ministry. And that whole time I was like, I don't know. But then one day, I was invited into a different story in some ways to kind of try it on by my youth pastor, who said, "Hey, would you go to camp? Would you go to camp and volunteer at camp?" And that question was an invitation into a story, because what I had to do is I had to imagine in my mind the story of what would it look like for me to go and work at camp for a week. Now, I had never been at camp. I had never done an overnight camp, and here I am, 16, 17 years old, thinking about going to camp to help people, to help students know and love Jesus. And I was invited to know this story. And I imagined the story of going, and I was a little bit nervous, I was a little bit scared, but I was also a little bit excited. And so I said yes. And while at camp, God renewed me and solidified his call of ministry over my life. And I changed which college I was going to go to, changed which degree program I was going to go into, and went into ministry, and here I am standing before you today. And it came down to the story that I was invited to believe in, and the story that I chose to believe, and it created this reality that's very real in the sense that I am here today in front of you because of this story that was spoken into me, and that I also was invited and chose to believe and live into. But we also believe a bunch of other stories as well. We believe stories that create fear, that create worry, that create anxiety. Any worriers in the room where like all you imagine is worst case scenario, right? Worst case scenario thinking it's a kind of story that we begin to imagine, that we begin to believe. And they begin to create a different type of reality around us. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the different stories that people believe in the story of David and Goliath. It's a familiar passage, but the way that we're going to approach it is going to be maybe unfamiliar. And I think that that's exciting. I think it's exciting that God's word is that deep that we can approach it in new ways and find new things and things that feel familiar. And so we're going to look at the stories that people believe throughout the story of David and Goliath and the realities that they create throughout the story, and how God might be wanting to create a new story and a new reality in us. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 17 in 1 Samuel, it says this. It says, "The Philistines mustered their army for battle and camped between Skosh and Judah and Azekah and Ephesus dominion. And Saul gathered his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. Then Goliath, the Philistine champion, came out of the Philistine ranks, and he came to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet. He had a bronze coat of mail that weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor-bearer walked ahead of him, carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across the Israelites. 'Why are you all coming out to fight? I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul.'" I'm going to pause there because here we have the first story that's being believed, and it's being believed by Goliath. So if we go to the next slide, we have Goliath claiming, I am the Philistine champion. We'll find later throughout the text that Goliath has been a man of war since his youth, a man of battle since his youth. You don't become the champion of the Philistines by accident. It is an entire identity filled with blood, sweat, tears, and a long history of killing other people. Because the only way that you get to remain the champion of the Philistines is that you never lose. Because the moment you lose, your life is over. For Goliath to lose and not become the champion anymore means his death has come. And so in a lot of ways, Goliath represents kind of the American story, the American dream of blood, sweat, and tears, and the self-made person. We got to work hard, we got to strive hard, and we can never lose. There's no room for error. And the thing about that self-made person, although you can feel prideful and you can feel strong because you haven't lost yet, it can all come tumbling down with just one rightly placed stone. But that's the story, and I think sometimes in our own lives, in our own building, we have lived the story of Goliath, where we've tapped ourselves on the shoulder, I am the champion. But the question comes, what happens when that stone comes and it begins to erode and collapse all that we've built? The next story comes immediately after that. And so he says, I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. He says, come out and fight me. If he kills me, we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. The story that Goliath gives the nation of Israel, it isn't that you are the armies of the Lord. It's not that you are the armies of God. It's not that you are great. It's not that you are the armies who God has delivered out of Egypt and into this land. It is, you are only servants of Saul. And the thing about Saul is that Saul was the tallest guy in Israel. And next to Goliath, he was short. And so Goliath is kind of physically taunting them and physically taunting Saul. And he puts out this idea that, like, yeah, if you were to somehow miraculously kill me, we'll become your slaves. But really, the punchline is at the end where he's like, you will become our slaves. You will become our slaves. And what it says is, he says, I defy the armies of Israel today. Send a man who fights me. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. So when Israel hears this story of themselves, of you are only servants of Saul and you will become our slaves, when I kill whoever you bring out to me, they believe that story. They believe that story. And the reality that is created from believing that story, that false story from Goliath, is that they are filled with fear. They're filled with deep fear. They're already imagining, even though they're on this side of the cliff and they are not slaves of the Philistines yet, they are already imagining and believing what it would be like to become slaves of the Philistines. They're already imagining the shame that it's going to bring upon their family, the embarrassment that it's going to have across the nation. I don't know if you've ever been so scared where you're sick and you almost want to throw up. I've got to believe that this is where the Israelite army is. They literally cannot imagine a different outcome to this story. And what I think is important here is that there are some kind of indicators in our own spirit that God gives us to be aware of when we begin to believe the wrong story. And so if we look at these on the next slide, there are essentially kind of three. There is shame. So whenever we're in a place and our story produces us the feelings of shame, it's most likely because we have begun to believe the wrong story. We've allowed the story of shame to define us. Because the story of Jesus is that he has come to take on our shame and remove our shame. When we experience fear, There's most likely a story that we're believing that isn't coming from the Lord, and it's creating anxiety and worry. And the Lord says, cast your fears upon me, and so that you can live at peace. Jesus has come to take our fear. And then finally, there's anger. Whenever we find ourselves angry, now there is definitely this righteous anger and this unrighteous anger, but no matter the case, God wants our anger and he can hold our anger. And normally what I find is that when I am angry, I normally only see a part of a truth. And that there is a whole other side of the story that I'm missing, that I've misunderstood. And so I am not trustworthy to believe the whole story when I am in a place of anger. And we see this also with David all the time throughout the Psalms. There's plenty of times where David is both in his flesh angry and in his spirit righteously angry. And what he does every time is that he brings his anger to the Lord and he lets him know. And then the Lord gives him a new story. He's reminded of the story of God and the peace of God and the truth of God. And as you go through the psalm, you begin to see this transformation where he begins angry, he experiences a new story, a new truth, because he's given it to God and he believes a new story. And the way that psalm ends is a different reality than what you'd expect from the anger that he begins with. It's because David enters into this practice of checking the stories that he believes all the time. And it's a practice that God is inviting us into all the time when we feel these emotions. And so just know that God has given us a built-in check engine light. And it is shame, fear, and anger. And I just want to encourage you, when you feel those things, to stop and to pause and to ask yourself, what story am I believing? And what's the true story of God? And how might God want to change my reality? Because when we're feeling shame, fear, and anger, we're already living into a type of reality that's broken. And so we've got to imagine and dream again, what could this new reality with Jesus and the true story of God actually look like? We're going to continue in the story here for a minute, and I'm not going to pause it. Everyone will review here in a second all of the stories that are kind of told, because this is when David begins to come on to the scene. Now, David was the son of a man named Jesse, an Ephrathite in Bethlehem, in the land of Judea. Jesse was an old man at the time, and he had 8 sons. Jesse's 3 oldest, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shema, had already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. David was the youngest. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. One day, Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers. And give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along, and bring back a report of how they're doing." David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early in the morning the next day with the gifts that Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts of battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion of Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the Israelite army. That's the thing about this story to the Israelites, is it wasn't just one time, but it was day after day after day of 40 days of the story being repeated into their minds. And I think sometimes we allow this to happen to ourselves, where we just get stuck in this spiral where the story of lies that brings fear, shame, and anger, we just can't get off of it. And it just feels like it comes again and again. And maybe that story is reinforced over here, and we run into another person or another situation, it's reinforced over there. And there's this kind of psychological phenomena where when we become aware of something, we begin to start to look for things and maybe even sometimes invent ways to affirm the story that we're believing, even if it's a bad story. And so I just want you to pay attention to that. The psychological warfare of the Philistine is intentional, and it's defiant, and it's working strongly against the nation of Israel. As soon as the Israel army saw him, they began to run away in fright. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king offered a huge reward for anyone who kills him. He'll give the man one of his daughters as a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempt from paying taxes." That's the American dream right there. David asked the soldiers standing nearby, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending the defiance against Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God? All these men gave David the same reply. They said, "Yes, that is the reward for killing him." But when David's oldest brother heard David talking to the men, he was angry. "What are you doing here anyways?" he demanded. "What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and your deceit. You just want to see the battle." "What have I done now?" David replied. "I was only asking a question." I mean, this is like the quintessential older brother, younger brother battle, right? Like, younger brother shows up, older brother's like, "What are you doing here? I know you. You think you always need to belong." And he's like, "I'm just asking a question." You know, I don't know any of you with little kids. That's like the easiest out. I haven't done anything wrong. So he walks over to some others and he asks the same things and he receives the same answer. David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. Before King Saul, David says, "Do not worry about this Philistine. I will go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way that you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and this man has been a man of war since his youth." So I want to take a pause for a second and just see the stories that David is invited to believe, but shunts off. Okay? So David, he comes in. The first story that he is told about who he is from his brothers. And so his brothers say, "You are too young. You are too young to be here. What are you doing here? You don't belong here." The next story that David is told is that you are prideful and you are a liar. And this is coming from his brothers. And then his brothers just straight out come out and say, "You don't belong here." Now, I don't know about you, but our families are incredibly important when it comes to shaping the stories that we believe about ourselves. And it can be deeply painful sometimes when our family provides us a story about ourselves, about our youth, about our attitude, about our emotions, and sometimes our own belonging. And I know for a lot of us, those stories are easy to believe. And for some of us, we might have believed those stories for a long time. The amazing thing about David is that David rejects those stories. He does not allow these stories to become the stories that define him, that create his identity. And he does not remain in the woundedness of that story. And I know that's easy for me to say, and I know it's easy to read, and I know it's incredibly difficult when a brother, a sister, a father, a mother, an aunt, or an uncle communicates your worth and value in a way that says, "You don't belong." But I want you to know that you have a Father that supersedes all human relationship, who became a human on our behalf to say, "You do belong, and you are loved, and you are welcome here." I don't want you to miss that. And I want you to see that David believes that story over the story of his family and his brothers. We then continue. The story continues. Now this time he's in front of King Saul. The stakes in some ways have gotten even higher. He's in front of the king of the nation. Next slide. The king says, "You are ridiculous. You cannot win." Now, I don't know about you. If the story of the brothers didn't get me, the story of King Saul would. I'd be like, you know what, King Saul? You are taller and wiser than me. You probably should be the one killing him. You're the biggest of us all. I guess I'm going to go. But David just stands there, and he takes it. And he continues, and King Saul continues too. King Saul continues to punch back, and he says this. He says, "You're just a boy. You're just a boy." And maybe you've been told that at some point. Maybe you've just believed like, well, I'm just a coworker, or I'm just a mom, or I'm just a son, or I'm just a nobody, I'm just a whatever. David continues to reject that story. And he says this. He says, "I have been taking care of my father's sheep and goats. When a lion or bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me and I catch it by the jaw and I club it to death, I have done this to both lions and bears, and I will do it again to this pagan Philistine. He has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine." I love this because this is a true picture of humility. David goes and he lists all the things that he has done. And if we don't stop and read that last line, "The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine," you're like, okay, David, I can see why your brothers think you're a little prideful. You've killed all these things. You think you're hot stuff. But the true version of humility is that David knows where his source of strength came from. And that is humility. I think sometimes we think that humility is that we've got to be quiet. We've got to be reserved. We can't make too much noise and we can't do great things. David, in his humility, has done great things. And he has done them loudly, and he's done them boldly. And it's all been done in humility because he has relied not on his own strength, but the strength that comes from the Lord. And it is this humility, and it is this strength, and it is this confidence, and it is David's belief in this story that begins to change the reality of a nation. Because Saul concedes, and he says, "All right, go ahead, and may the Lord be with you." So the Lord gave David his armor, bronze helmet, coat of mail. He put it on. He's like, "These don't work. I'm not used to them." Instead, he said, "I'm going to go with the sling and pick up 5 stones." And so that's where we're going to pick up the story. He says he picks up 5 stones from the stream, and he puts them in his shepherd's bag. Armed with only the shepherd's staff and a sling, he starts across the valley of the Philistine. Goliath walked towards David and his shield bearer, sneering at him in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. David says, "Am I a dog that you come at me with a stick? I will feed you to the wild animals." Again, another opportunity for David to believe another story. You are just a stick, and he could begin to imagine and dream his dead body being eaten by the wild animals. And again, David counters with not his story, but the story of his God. And he says, "Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you, and I will cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds of the air and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, not by sword and spear, but this is the Lord's battle that he will give to us." If we continue, we see that Goliath moves closer. David reaches into his shepherd's bag. He hurls the stone. He hits the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sinks in. Goliath stumbles and falls face down on the ground. David triumphs over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David ran over, pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath. David used it to kill him and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran. And then the men of Israel and Judah gave a great shout of triumph and rushed after the Philistines, chasing them as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. And the bodies of the dead and wounded Philistines were strewn along the road of Sharim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the Israelite army returned and plundered the deserted Philistine camp. David's belief in the story of God allowed the nation of Israel to believe again in the story of God. And the reality is that you are going to face people in your life who are believing the wrong story. They're going to be like the nation of Israel. They're going to be terrified. They're going to be angry. They're going to be filled with shame. And they're not going to be able to imagine a different story. And you can tell them that story, the story that you don't have to believe the story, and there's a better story. But sometimes what they need is somebody to believe the new and better and true story so much that you believe it for them and live it out for them on their behalf. And if we want to see our nation grow in faith, that is what we need to begin to do. We need to begin to live out the story of our faith in front of those who have believed false stories and give them hope of a new story. Because in a moment, the Israelites went from being slaves and throwing up in fear to cheering and pursuing the enemy to the ends of the earth and conquering on behalf of our God. What I want you to know about the story of David and Goliath, next slide, is that it isn't about fighting your own battles. And it's not about fighting your own battles alone. It isn't about mustering up your own strength to face your own giants. It isn't even about having enough faith to face the giants on your own. When I look at the story of David and Goliath, the real question is, next slide, is what story are you listening to? And what story are you believing in? There are two stories that we can believe and live into. The first story, next slide, is a story that accuses, condemns, or are we believing the story that forgives and rescues and restores? The ways that we can know that we're believing in that first story, next slide, is that we live lives of fear, of worry, of shame, of hurry. How many of us are so much in a hurry that we're like, I can't do anything else because I just got to get everything done? It's not the life that God has called us to live. How many of us manipulate our coworkers and the people that are around us to get what we want? That is not the story that God has called us to live in. Instead, he's called us to live in his Spirit. Next slide. When we live into the story of God, even when the circumstances try to tell us a different story, right? All these stories that David could have believed and all the stories that Israel believed were external. They were coming from the world and the people around them. And the stories of this world and the stories of the people around us look to destabilize us and cause us to live a life in this way. And I want you to know this morning that God has come to save us from this life. He has given us a better story to live a better life that looks like this. Next slide. A life that is full of love. A life that is full of joy. A life that is full of patience and peace and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and self-control. Which story and which reality do you want to live into and have the world live into today, tomorrow, and into the future? And what I want you to know is that the good news of Jesus is that this story where love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control, it wins. And it's where we're going, and it's what it means for the kingdom to come in our life today, now, and forever. Would you pray with me? Father God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the story of David and Goliath. And we thank you for all of the opportunities that David could have believed the wrong story. But God, we thank you for his faithfulness. And we thank you that your story was so ingrained upon his heart that he had full confidence of you in your story. And how through his faithfulness, he was able to bring peace and joy and goodness to the nation of Israel. God, help us to believe your story that you have come to redeem us from our fear, that you have come to redeem us from our anger, and you have come to redeem us from our shame. God, allow us to be free from those stories today. Deliver us from those realities in our world today. And allow us to breathe and believe a new story with new realities that can only come from you. That is for your glory and our joy. Amen.